following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
Individually, I love the graph. I love what you guys do. I'm a big fan of, the indexing of the on-chain data and serving for DApps. And recently, we start to do like an integration with the graph. As we're a layer one, like a EVM chain, I think the low-hanging fruit here is getting graph to indexing all the IoTeX EVM data.
GRTiQ podcast.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Raullen Chai, CEO and co-founder at IoTeX and MachineFi. IoTeX is a decentralized blockchain platform tailored for the Internet of Things, aiming to enhance the security, privacy, and efficiency of IoT device interactions and data exchange. MachineFi, an innovative concept introduced by IoTeX, merges decentralized finance with IoT devices. As per usual, Raullen is another brilliant and insightful Web3 founder with deep insight and strong conviction for Web3 and blockchain. During our interview, Raullen talks about his background, his university education, and his journey into Web3, which included stops along the way at Oracle, Google, and Uber. And then we talk about the origins of IoTeX and MachineFi. During this fun conversation, Raullen will discuss DePIN, including the inside scoop on the origins of the term, the future of Web3, and how important the graph is for IoTeX and MachineFi, and how it fits into DePIN. I started the conversation with Raullen by asking about where he's from.
Sure, thanks for having me, Nick. Yeah, I was born in China, but I kind of grew up in Canada, then end up here in US right now. Yeah, as a young person, it's pretty normal kid like anybody else, but I'm just a person full of curiosity, right? I don't listen to teachers a lot. I just mess up things because I'm just too curious. What is going on? What sort of things behind the phenomenon? That's about me.
Where did you develop this curiosity? I mean, was it something you were just born with, or is that something you developed over time?
No, I think it's sort of like the part of me when I was born. It's a natural instinct, basically. I'm just curious about everything. I don't read textbooks a lot. I want to figure out the things by myself.
Raullen, obviously you ended up working in technology. You're a serial entrepreneur. You've been involved in a lot of very cool projects. What can you tell us about any memories or moments from your childhood that you think sort of shaped your interest in entrepreneurship or technology? Are there any?
Yeah, I think when I was 10 or 10-ish, actually I got my first computer, right? Computer at that time was sort of like a luxury gift from the parents. I'm so thankful for that. Then this computer thing leads me into basically open up my eyes for the entire new world. So that makes me being a kind of white hand hacker at that time. I just trying to, not just to mess up my own thing, right? Also trying to mess up other people's stuff. But of course, I telling them how to fix. I make a couple of some dollars, I think, in my summer break, just trying to hack into some website and telling them how to fix. Yeah, that's also fun and a good revenue stream for my early life.
That's amazing. One theme that comes up all the time with tech entrepreneurs like yourself is getting early exposure, like you described there, to tech in the home with a computer or something. But sometimes they say they took it apart, like they like to understand exactly how this thing works, so they would disassemble it and try to reassemble it. Were you one of those?
I'm definitely one of those, actually. That's a lot of fun, right? So you poke different parts all together. Does it work? Does it work better or worse? You just change a graphic card, purchase a new one to put into a CPU, right? So you want to overclock the CPU, you want to destroy something. That's a lot of fun, actually.
That white hat hacking is an interesting thing. And clearly in the crypto world, there's a lot of hacking that goes on, and it's not always white hat. It's something different. But as a young person, you were working on this. I mean, do you have any fun stories or experiences you had doing that, and maybe some big projects that you worked with or hacked on?
Yeah, I think as a kid, actually, I also wrote like a malware actually for some other people, right? At that time, I think like those Windows 0-day exploits was very popular. So someone came to me and says, oh, I pay you few some dollars, can just wrote a malware for me, right? So I can just spread that around the world. Yes, I did that. It looks like it's kind of working. But later I kind of regret, right? That could destroy a lot of systems actually out there. But that's still like a part of the fun memories I have in my early life.
Does working on those types of problems, so like this hacking type of problem, does that in some way give you deeper education and understanding on how the tech works and how software works?
Yeah, that's for sure. That basically like a very good course project helped me to understand a lot of like in-depth stuff about the internet, like how you propagate like software from one computer to another, and also like the software stack. So how do you use some sort of exploit to get into like somebody else's system? How does Windows works? How does programming language works? That makes me familiar with the entire stack for the computer world.
Well, eventually you grow up and go on to get a PhD you work a lot in blockchain and cryptography. So what can you tell us about your PhD days and the types of things that you were studying and researching?
Yeah, so this one also ties back to my early experience as a white-hat hacker, right? As a white-hat hacker, so you're mostly trying to leverage some bugs that has been identified by other people. Then you just write a malware, for example, to basically take in profit or leverage. So this sort of thing is just too shallow. I want to go into one level deeper into the entire security world, which is cryptography, which is the foundation for security, right? That talks about encryption, decryption, privacy, compute, trusted compute, so on and so forth. So that's where I decided, okay, so I'm going to definitely like doing a PhD here, trying to really understand what is shit going on here. That's where I did my PhD in Waterloo, really focused on cryptography. At that time, our research is mostly about can you design an encryption algorithm that no one else can crack. And at the same time, we're also trying to crack the encryption algorithm that's designed by other people. It's sort of like attack and defense game. That was really, really cool. I love it.
When you think about the state of art of cryptography, and clearly this existed before Web3 and blockchain and cryptos, but do you see it as the emergence of the Web3 industry sort of pushing the frontiers of cryptography and leveraging maybe that discipline in a way that we wouldn't have otherwise? How do you see that?
Oh man, that's a really, really awesome question. Indeed, right? So when I was doing my PhD from 2008 to 2012, Bitcoin was just born, was not popular at all, right? It's just, few people knows about Bitcoin. We are maybe like one of them, but most of people don't, right? So they are doing like cryptography for the purpose of loving the technology, right? Who would spend a lot of time on your career life just working on some like deep math stuff? Because the core of cryptography is mathematics. So you have to basically poke with the number, simulation, calculation, design, very complicated number series, try to do a cryptography system. This is purely or maybe authentic, like a passion for math or for cryptography. No one really taking profit from here. But after the blockchain as an industry kind of emerged in the past 10 years or so, more people, more capital actually, specifically getting into this area, right? That makes people really, really profitable when they're talking about zero knowledge proof, when they're talking about fully homomorphic encryption, those very advanced topics in the cryptography area, right? Which was used to be only interested by academic researchers.
One sleight of hand, if you will, that I think people like me that are not technical sometimes misunderstand or don't fully comprehend is everything you just said about cryptography and how Web3, blockchain, all of this technology leverages cryptography, but yet there is a going concern about privacy in Web3. So how should we non-technical people kind of reconcile the fact that cryptography is reaching new frontiers, but yet there is still this kind of going concern about privacy and protecting privacy?
Cryptography is about being private, right? So it's always talking about authentication, authorization, encryption stuff, basically trying to protect yourself as a person to other people or maybe centralized parties like governments, like companies, like corporations. In its heart, it was like a military technology at the very beginning, and then it's kind of civilized after this many years. So yeah, I think privacy is definitely like a very big part of the cryptography, but cryptography kind of goes beyond privacy a lot these days. For example, those ZK stuff, right? their knowledge stuff. It's mostly talking about can you do a compute off the chain in the real world about something without being tampered, but you can prove like I'm doing the right compute to a smart contract or blockchain. So those things definitely go beyond privacy.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, pooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTiQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the Graph. Take us back in time, if you don't mind, Raullen, and tell us about when you first became aware of what was going on in cryptocurrencies. And you mentioned Bitcoin just a moment ago. What were your first impressions, and what did you think at the time?
I thought this was too good to be true, because there are so many researchers, trying to find this holy grail of, digital currency in the past. There are so many research papers in the past, and no one succeeded, right? So there are always a flaw in the system here and there, or it's too complicated, not practical at all. No one going to use it. When we saw the idea of Bitcoin, we saw it's so simple, it cannot work. Why would it work, right? But turns out it's working very well. Which I'm so glad. Because like this design of Bitcoin, so they just taking another dimension of information, which is this like a finance, like a lens to see how the system works. All the previous work about digital currency is mostly about on the tech side, on the cryptography side. Well, I do this signature, I do this encryption algorithm, I do this authentication. There's always some sort of flaw. But if you look at the problem from a different lens, the problem gets solved. So this is amazing.
So if I'm looking at the research I did in preparation for this interview, I clearly see tech, cryptography, entrepreneurship as a major theme that sort of ties the narrative of your life together. But there's this other topic that we must also discuss, which is IoT, or Internet of Things. And so kind of on the heels of what you said about Bitcoin, what can you tell us about what IoT, Internet of Things is, and how you sort of got interested in that discipline?
Yeah, in my early life, right? So at that time, like internet or mobile internet is not as popular as of now. So a lot of people actually, they just like being the tinkers doing all the, like Arduino stuff per se, right? Raspberry Pi stuff. I'm definitely like one of them. And also in my PhD research, like the encryption or cryptography stuff we did is mostly for the IoT devices. So they have to be like a very lightweight, so those smaller devices can actually leverage. So this is like the IoT side. Then later, I also I work for Uber for almost 2 years. That also makes me like a really, really interested into cars, how these things transport people from A to B and making money. Yeah.
I got a lot of follow-up questions about your time at Uber, and we'll get to those in a minute here. But if we try to explain what IoT is to a non-technical person, what is Internet of Things? Like, how is this relevant? What is it?
Yeah, it's essentially like a small piece of devices, not necessary to be small, but it's a device, right? That could be smart, that could be connected to the cloud or connect to each other. Think about your phone, your smart home camera. Think about your like a weather station maybe at home, or maybe your ring on your finger that monitor your heart rate while you're asleep. That's all sort of IoT. It's everywhere right now.
Understood. So let's go back to your personal story a little bit here. So you get a PhD, you're studying cryptography, you become interested in what's going on in crypto world and things like that. What did you actually do after college though? How did you get started professionally?
Yeah, I spent like a few months in Oracle, but it's definitely like a giant, slow, big company, right? And then I just joined Google rightly after Oracle, stayed there for 5 years, leading team for security, infrastructure, a few cloud products for Google. That was a very fascinating time. Basically, I got a lot of exposure to how the infrastructure distributed system should look like. That basically sets me up ready for building the blockchain later.
I mean, if you list all the tech companies to go work for at the time, Oracle's got to be right up at the top. Google, you mentioned a moment ago that you also went to Uber. Can we double click a little bit on your experiences at Oracle and Google? I mean, what did you learn about software, about business by virtue of having exposure at such large companies?
I was talking this with another friend the other day. Like each generation should have their or define their own industry. For example, if you think about Google, Oracle, so they were all born around 1990s. That's when Larry Page, those founders are like a really young. So they gather a crowd of like young people, passionate people like themselves, to really building something fascinating and world changing. That's Google, that's Oracle. I kind of like this one. But of course, as time goes by, they're getting old. The entire company is getting old, getting big, getting very kind of hierarchical. Then everything kind of slows down. But we're seeing like the pattern gets repeated in crypto, right? So nowadays, maybe like 5 years back, so all the young, passionate people like you, like me, are actually getting into crypto. So we want to build like a new world by our rules. So that's kind of like a fascinating if you try to link crypto back to Google or Oracle.
That idea has come up once before on this podcast. In fact, it was framed a little differently, but somebody was talking about the roots of Bitcoin and this push towards decentralization. And they were raising the flag that, in fact, we're sort of trending towards centralization because of the size of some of the participants in the ecosystem, but as well as these centralized exchanges. What's your opinion on that? I mean, you're seeing kind of large Web 2 type signatures maybe emerging within the Web 3. Are you also seeing a return or a little bit of a pivot towards centralization?
Yeah, that's a more ideological question, right? If you look at the news, like the why Ethereum ETF gets approved, so why people are interested in those ideas is there's an old world, so there's a new world, right? So we want this new world to be fully decentralized, even like no government at all, right? But the reality is you have to tie this new world back to the old world in a way, because we're all like the same people living in the same world. So I feel like even Vitalik, I feel like when he was young, when Ethereum was like just got started, like the idea is trying to build like this decentralized society, basically. But as time goes by, everybody realized the fully decentralization is coming at a cost, basically. So some sort of like a centralization or maybe some part of the system should be centralized, I think is the reality.
So much of the discussion about what Web3 is, and a lot of people, they don't even accept that terminology, but for the sake of this question, let's assume that there is a Web3 and we both agree kind of that that's the right term. When you contrast it with Web2, people kind of say, well, Web3 is a revolution. It's a pivot away from the sins of Web 2. It's all these other types of things. How do you think about the emergence of Web 3? Is it like an evolutionary step? Is it a revolution? I mean, how do you think about that?
I think it's a revolutionary stuff for sure. But usually people are kind of overestimate in the short term, but underestimate in the long run. Right? If you think about like when Facebook coming out, they're promoting this idea of like a network of people. So many people are kind of overhyped by this like a new idea, right? Then after this many years, Facebook just become like a website plus a few like popular social apps. So it's not that kind of disruptive. But if you really think about it, it is disruptive because now we're all living on Instagram. We're all living on WhatsApp, right? So they're part of our life. We feel it's not disruptive enough is perhaps because it's become part of life. So I feel like the same for cryptography, right? It's not going to like disrupt the entire world and have like a new sort of like a rules for the new world, but it will like change our world in a way that we cannot sense, basically. So for example, tomorrow, if you take a Uber, then all the underlying system is actually orchestrated by a blockchain, by a bunch of decentralized systems. That's kind of like a weird crypto is taking over the world.
Is part of the argument you just made there that at the end of the day, users don't actually care about what rails this thing is on. They just kind of want the value. And so if it's blockchain that's running Uber or a centralized server, what does the user care?
No. User doesn't care about the underlying stuff. I really care about the experience. Did I get like a Uber that is cheaper than before? Did I get like a faster service than before? Those are things that they do care.
One last question about your time at places like Oracle, Google, Uber. Do you ever think about how they'll respond either competitively or just existentially to the emergence of something like Web3?
I'm sorry, can you elaborate this question?
Sure. So based on your time at those big Web 2 companies, do you have a guess or an idea of how they might respond to something like Web 3 that's growing and might gain greater adoption?
Yeah, that's really hard, to be honest. So I think there's a book talking about the theory. Basically, like a company's internal structure or culture, organization structure is designed or optimized or maybe evolved into like the business is doing. For example, for Google, right? The major business is search, maybe YouTube as well. So entire like the mindset, the culture, the org structure people value most is sort of those big businesses. So Web3 to them is nothing. No one really cares about. Of course, there are some like pioneers within Google, I'm sure. So they're promoting Web3 a lot. But does the management care? Maybe not too much.
So let's then talk about 2017, a pivotal year for you. It's when you start your first entrepreneurial venture and decide to leave kind of that Web 2 large company environment and go co-found and launch a project. Take us back in time. What was happening in your life and what were you thinking about at that time?
Yeah, so personally speaking, I'm like a very early Ethereum investor, right? So I'm always looking at like what is going on with Ethereum, starting from I think 2013 or 2014 when Ethereum was born. Actually, I feel like it's a time right now. I feel like this is like a new world. It's like a full of energy, full of possibility, full of like young, smart people, hungry people here. So that's where I belong to. Plus, I have spent too many years within those big companies. Uber is small, but like Google is a big company. I feel like I kind of sick of those big corporation culture. It's kind of slow, bureaucratic. Everything you have to asking for 10% to prove. I want just like getting things done. I want like making a new system. I want making something that's basically changing the world. I feel like, okay, so this is an opportunity plus my cryptography background. This is an opportunity I cannot say no to. So that's why I'm getting a lot of support from parents, wife, and everybody around me says, you should do this.
So what did you do? You eventually started with a seed of an idea to do what?
Yeah, then we kind of, gathering together, like with two other co-founders, Kevin and Jane. We're kind of sitting down saying, how we do this, right? So in the crypto space, how we can really making crypto like a massive adoption. What sort of like a lacking pieces here? If you think blockchain is the system for the new world, then what sort of like an integration process, right? How do we help other people to promote or understand what is going on here? Then IoT becomes sort of like a connector or bridge between the real world and the crypto world, right? So that's where we think, okay, so we really should double down on this one.
And so what was the original vision of IoT? What was sort of the launch thesis, if you will?
Yeah, I think like a slogan we used to have is like connecting the real world to crypto. Exactly what I'm talking about. And we do think IoT as a technology is sort of like the bridge.
And how then has it evolved since 2017?
That's a long story. So after being here for 6 years, right? So I learned a lot, definitely grew a lot with the team. At the very beginning, we kind of like focus on the blockchain side. We built this layer one chain from 2017 to 2019. We actually launched, the chain has been running in production for already like 4 years, no accident. Processed 100 million transactions already, once on TPS, not bad at all. 100 more, maybe 120-ish delegates globally, right? The chain has been a success. We kind of like grow the ecosystem on the chain in the year of 2020. At that time, like a DeFi NFT game was popular, right? Or were popular at that time. So we have like a roughly 200 sort of those projects, sprouting on IoTeX layer one chain. That was a huge success. Then starting from the year of 2021, 2022, we started to think about, okay, so how about the IoT part, right? So we promised to the world, we're connecting blockchain to the real world. Then where's the bridge? Where's the connector, right? That's what we kind of like dive into, like the IoT perspective of the project. Of course, we can talk about this more later. So then we came up with the thesis we call MachineFi. And Masari guy says, oh, let's call it DePIN. Let's just call DePIN altogether. That's where DePIN as a term basically emerged around the year of 2021 or 2022-ish. Then all the builders, people, VCs actually gather around. That's where DePIN was born.
Amazing. I want to ask you a lot more about DePIN. It's one of these buzzwords right now in the industry that emerged, and a lot of people are talking about it. Before we do that, though, Talk to us about entrepreneurship. So, as I said, you were working in big Web2 companies. They were slow moving, but working on very monumental things, doing things at scale. So, really cool experience. What did you learn about entrepreneurship by virtue of what you started with IoT and, all subsequent ventures, including MachineFi?
I realized I want to do something truly amazing, disruptive, and I would never regret about. So I should not touch on the existing business from the big corporations like a Google, like Oracle, right? So they already kind of monopolize entire, let's say, search or AI industry. I should find my niche, right? So which is like unexplored land per se. So where I can build like some sort of like a rules or orders or products or systems, then, so that's kind of like a new world, basically unlocking a new business opportunity. So that's my kind of high level philosophy about where I should be.
So if that's a top level sort of philosophical perspective of find your niche, don't go head to head with the monopoly, what would you say are the 2 or 3 characteristics that make a successful entrepreneur?
I think most importantly is persistent. So you have to be persistent because there are so many frustrations, right? So many bumpers almost every day that keeps you down. You almost have to have a big heart to be here. Otherwise, you will feel like deeply depressed. Why things usually don't work, right? So this is very true in the book of this like hard things about what's the name?
Hard Things About Hard Things, I think, or something like that from Horowitz, I believe.
Yeah, exactly, right? They're talking about the same thing, right? Like basically as a founder, maybe 1 out of 100 days, you're happy, and the rest of 99 days, you're just in a pain. So persistence is definitely like a very important. I think that's one. The second one is growth, right? So when we actually, as sort of like the first time entrepreneur into the space, we don't have enough resources. We don't have deep enough understanding what is going on. So that means as a founder, you have to learn really, really fast, right? You're trying to probe information from different people, from different entities, and then you're trying to digest and think about what does this mean to you, right? Are we doing the right thing? You should always like reflect almost every day. Are we on the right track? Something's going wrong. So I think this also needs some sort of like a talent here in terms of like a fast learner.
I want to ask you about persistence because it comes up all the time on this podcast. In fact, I think the vast majority of entrepreneurs I've interviewed have said something to the effect that persistence is one of the most important characteristics, but it doesn't actually explain what must exist downstream of that. In other words, what drives someone's persistence? And in your particular case, why do you persist? Why don't you give up when it's difficult or when it was difficult when you launched? Like what drives you?
Yeah, I think it's always some curiosity, right? Can I build like some sort of like a new thing, for example, DePIN as a category, right? Because of the things I'm thinking about or like the team has been working on. So this is extremely to me. So I saw there are 2 types of guys who are not persistent. One is after like 1 or 2 times of failure, they just gave up, right? Says, oh, this is not my world. I'm just changing to something new and hot, maybe AI right now. So that's one type of guy. So this is very normal. And another type of guy is when they have some financial success, right? Like they earn like, I don't know, like $1 million, whatever, right? So they start to give up too. They think, oh, I'm good, right? I have enough money for the rest of my life. I have a big house right now, then they just gave up. That happens when you don't really have a big picture in you or a big vision in you.
Let's talk then a little bit more about 2021. And you said there you co-founded and launched MachineFi Lab. So if you've explained what IoT is, help us understand what the vision was and the idea behind MachineFi Lab.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, right? So I mentioned about after a year of 2021, 2022, we identified that this is how the IoT and blockchain should work together. That's why we come up with a thesis, which is called MachineFi. And that time we were kind of doing like an equity raise. So the co-founder says, how about we call the US entity just MachineFi Labs? So that's where this name is coming from. For now, it's also like the MachineFi Labs for the US entity for the IoTeX team, for sure, right? But as I mentioned earlier, so Masari, so they're like a big media, they're a bunch of great people. So they think DePIN is a better name. So we say, okay, we don't mind too much to change MachineFi as a category name to DePIN. So that's why like everybody kind of sitting together says, let's just call DePIN together.
I've had the opportunity to have many members of the Messari team on this podcast, so longtime listeners will remember a lot of those guests and they'll know that name, Messari. What types of problems or services specifically is MachineFi Lab seeking to address or produce?
Yeah, so MachineFi Lab is definitely like working on the IoTeX tech stack of products. Well, like the mission is kind of even goes beyond the IoTeX a little bit. It's trying to really like redefine this DePIN as a category because we saw so many kind of things in the DePIN space that's not going right. So we want, of course, our best effort trying to redefine the DePIN as a category from the thesis perspective, from the philosophical perspective, from the tech perspective. If we can do this right, I would love to see like a DePIN kind of flourish everywhere. I'm always joking about with my people, like as we are living US, we don't really need DePIN, right? We have like the 5G, we have Uber, everything's here is so good. It's kind of setting up and easy to use. But if you think about like developing areas like Latin, Southeast Asia, right? Even like those regions, do they have Wi-Fi? Maybe not, right? Do they have like a Uber? Maybe not. If our work as a DePIN infra provider can help them or like a local smaller teams to setting up like a Wi-Fi for like a 500 people in a village, that's such a success, making the world a better place.
So you've said it 2 or 3 times now, but I got to come back to it. The origin of DePIN, which is now a buzzword throughout all of Web3, the origins of that was a conversation that you had with a member of the Messari team. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Who was it?
Sammy.
Amazing.
Sammy was the first Messari guy actually coined the term DePIN, decentralized physical infrastructure networks.
What do you make of what's happened since that time? I mean, I've talked a lot on this podcast about how certain narratives or top level themes emerge with each cycle and they become a little bit of a hype word, a buzzword. Has DePIN become one of those, or is there still something super tangible, mission driven about the use of that term?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? So when you define a category, you want to be inclusive enough, right? So like the existing players, like the investors, VCs, projects, medias, so they want to naturally like attach themselves to this category. That's kind of important, right? If you define something like no one really cares about, then it's not going anywhere. Second one, I feel like this is also aligned with the trend that crypto is actually going to the real world. If you saw the Bitcoin ETF gets approved early this year, then Ethereum ETF right now, that definitely means crypto is getting into the real world. So that's just from the finance perspective, in terms of ETF. But from like a real world kind of adoption perspective, there must be something else. So I feel like we are almost like a trending on this trend.
And for listeners that aren't fully aware of what DePIN is, and I'll put some links in the show notes because you've written about this topic, and of course, many others have as well, but just help us understand. So DePIN is just a category, and some projects, protocols within Web3 want to be included in there. There's certain criteria. I mean, help us understand kind of what is meant by DePIN and how people relate to it.
Yeah, I think the best way to understand it is just by example, right? I used to use Uber as an example a lot because DePIN also shares some sort of like spirit with sharing economy, which was a hot buzzword a few years back. So definitely like a Uber, Airbnb. So if they can be like a rebuilt in a decentralized fashion, so they are definitely like a DePIN. There are other services or utilization services such as like a 5G wireless network, even like a storage network, right? So think about Google Drive, Dropbox, the storage network, compute network, right? So as some of you guys play those like cloud games, right? You don't have a high-end graphic card on your computer to play those 3D games, but you are leveraging some like a remote servers who's doing the rendering for your game. Then you just have a screen, a very simple kind of computer, so you just play the game. So those are categorized as compute. So all those things are actually categorized as DePIN projects right now.
If we go back to what you said about Web3 being, an evolutionary, kind of revolutionary type of break from Web 2, you just explained DePIN and the origins of the term, which I found super interesting. How does decentralization relate to your thinking on this? And maybe I'll ask it this way. Does the stack that powers Web3 into the future, Is it required to be decentralized?
So this is a complicated question, right? So there are a lot of layers in terms of tech, right? Especially in DePIN. So we can think about the settlement layer is always like the blockchain smart contract. But adding on top, so we have like a hardware layer, like there are some middleware doing compute storage. So there are even some other layers or components in between. So that means like a DePIN has a very complicated tech stack. Entire stack, I don't feel like it has to be fully decentralized. For example, like hardware manufacturing, right? As we all know, Bitcoin, if you think Bitcoin is the biggest DePIN project in the world, then who's manufacturing the Bitcoin mining machines? Just few of like manufacturers in the world, right? So that part is kind of decentralized, but that's fine. Like Bitcoin as a network is still kind of very decentralized.
Do you have a hard opinion on what part of the stack must be decentralized? Is that something that you have a strong opinion about?
I feel like the settlement layer, like the asset layer, the smart contract layer should be fully decentralized, right? So even like the middle layer should be somehow decentralized. But like a hardware layer, especially if you think about like NVIDIA, right? So a lot of like a DePIN project saying, oh, we're doing AI compute, then everybody uses NVIDIA cards. That's something like that cannot be decentralized practically.
When you think back to the early days, you started thinking about the Internet of Things, you launched IoT, and now, decentralization, DePIN, all these things sort of came a little bit later. But how do you think about the convergence of these things all kind of coming to a head within Web3? Is it just, in your mind, serendipitous, or was this just the direction all these things were ultimately heading?
Yeah, like I said, right? So definitely like the trend is crypto going to the real world. And how? Of course, financial-wise, going through like a ETF or maybe some sort of like a NASDAQ listing in the future. Every people's life's perspective is more about how we kind of optimizing the existing utility services in a way. So it's faster, cheaper, or like maybe leverage some idle devices in the world, right? Or maybe just like trying to pay people based on the data they have. For example, we have some like ecosystem project. They're doing like a ring, they're doing watch. Those are the ideas, basically, collecting data from people, but like do a UBI style, sort of like a reward to the people. This is especially true for people who's living in the developing countries, for sure. But entirely, what I was thinking about DePIN that is not going all right is because of this tech big stack we were talking about. That means like if you want to do a DePIN project, you have to have have a lot of people because they have to work on different layers of the tech. That means you have to raise a lot of money to do that job. At the same time, which team can raise a lot of money? Most like the very high-end US-based team can raise a lot of money. But like we said, US doesn't really need a lot of DePIN networks. Can we help those builders in the developing countries kind of like doing a DePIN projects in a very low cost way or no upfront cost way? So that's kind of like what we're thinking about. Okay, so this is the way DePIN should be going. We're in the middle of launching like IoTeX 2.0, by the way. So a lot of things about 2.0 is called DePIN for everyone. That means we want to kind of democratizing the entire giant DePIN tech stack into a smaller chunk of modules. Then all the kind of builders in the world can actually come here to co-building this module. That makes like the DePIN application developer's job way easier. For example, if you have like a few people coming, maybe 3 guys, they have a great idea to spin up like a Wi-Fi network in Southeast Asia countries. They can just like leverage the entire modular stack, do a DePIN project over a weekend, right? Then gets launched, serving a few hundred people. To me, that's a huge success.
I agree. And I caught the vision in your answer there. It's remarkable, the stuff you're working on there. If you think about what you said about capital, access to capital, what other challenges sort of stand in the way right now in the early days here of DePIN and where it needs to go?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I just tweeted about this one. We saw like a high-end or like high-profile projects, they maybe raise too much money at the very beginning. That creates problem too. I was talking with this with Robert from 1KX the other day is if they raise too much money upfront, it's almost for sure they are going to build in like, because DePIN has a demand side and supply side. Supply side almost means like a device network, and demand side means like how people are going to use the utility from the devices, right? So if you raise too much money, it's almost for sure means you're going to build like a too much on the supply side initially. That creates like a huge network of machines. Maybe 99% of them are kind of useless. So that's like a waste of like the resources, right? So that's one type of team that is just too much. Another type of like a smaller kind of young DePIN projects is they have no way to raise capital. That's another problem they have, right? If you have no way to raise capital at all, then how you build like a network? You have to have a token, rewarding people who's buying your devices and, providing utility. If you don't really have a token or like upfront capital, then how do you do the token well? So that's kind of like an imbalance in the DePIN space right now.
If you zoom out and look at all of Web3, what grade would you give it in terms of what you've been mentioning there, which is kind of abstracting away the Web3 rails and just delivering a good experience for the average everyday person? I mean, how is the industry doing at this stage?
I think we're definitely like doing great. I saw a lot of, great people getting into the industry. When we were launching the year of 2017 year end, right? So we feel like we're kind of rock star team on the market. But now, like we saw like a lot of very, very strong teams actually, building different parts of entire Web3 stack, which is fascinating for sure. And in terms of adoption, very much different from 2017, 2018, where most of people are talking about how do we do the consensus, how do we do the sharding, right? It's mostly thinking from a technology perspective. Now we heard about many people talking about, how do we, serving people with Wi-Fi? How do we serving people with, this sort of utility or that, which is a big, big improvement to me.
If we remove DePIN as one of the themes that might be at the top of everybody's mind during the next cycle, so if we kind of remove that, what are some other themes or narratives that you think we should keep an eye on as crypto continues to evolve during this cycle?
Yeah, so that's the things I'm also asking myself every day, right? I feel like the hype for DeFi is definitely gone. But like the finance innovations will not stop here in the decentralized land. So there will still be a lot of people kind of experimenting different ideas. Maybe we're just waiting for the next Uniswap moment. It's like an AMM, right? So entire like a DeFi summer is because of innovation of AMM. So I cannot help myself thinking about what if, right? So there is another sort of like a AMM moment. The DeFi could be like going to the next level. So definitely got my eyes on DeFi. Another interesting thing I'm also looking at is like this prediction market. So this has been mentioned by Vitalik many, many years back, but never kind of taking off. Because we're getting to the real world, serving real people, I find this like a combination of finance and real world data or use cases or scenarios will actually become really powerful, right? So people can betting on, who's getting to elected as the next president in US? Is Ethereum ETF gets final approval when it starts to trade, right? So those things become tradable or bettable. So this is also a very interesting one. But I feel like the form of the product should be improved as well for the prediction market.
I appreciate your take on those two things. So I want to just ask you a couple questions about the graph, and then I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. What can you tell us about kind of your perspective on the graph protocol? It's my understanding that IoTeX and Machine Labs uses or leverages the graph. Is that correct?
Yes. So individually, I love the graph. I love what you guys do. I'm a big fan of, the indexing of the on-chain data and serving for dApps. And recently we start to do like an integration with the graph. As we're a layer one, like a EVM chain, I think the low-hanging fruit here is getting graph to indexing all the IoTeX EVM data for now. But, as next steps, we can also talk about how the graph can even help us to indexing more kind of off-chain data coming from the devices, coming from the real world. I think this will be a really, really big game changer.
And how do you place the graph in that whole DePIN story and narrative?
Yeah, it's some sort of like an off-chain compute. So I think off-chain compute should really be scenario-based, right? So some of the off-chain compute is about, verification of the devices is actually doing its work. So this is one type of off-chain compute. Another one is definitely like what you guys are working on is, can you index the data? For example, all the sensor data or maybe weather station data in the United States by time series data off-chain, right? that then you can serve the data to an on-chain, like a DeFi or like a weather derivative DeFi sort of a DApp later, right? Then people can just like developing like a weather derivative products in a decentralized way.
So there's no question in your mind that the graph sort of belongs within that DePIN categorization?
No, I do see like the graph as an important component of the entire DePIN landscape.
The last question I want to ask you before I ask you the GRTiQ 10 then is, you said a lot of your drive, a lot of your early interest in life all stem from this curiosity that you have. It's just part of your character. What are you most curious about knowing or seeing in the blockchain industry as a whole? Like 10 years from now, what would be the one question you kind of are most curious to know the answer to?
I don't know. My thinking is like how far or how much freedom we still have in the crypto industry, right? I feel like we have less freedom compared to maybe 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, because we are getting mainstream. So that's most like our curse plus our bliss, as a crypto industry. For example, right, I don't know, like the internal news about Ethereum gets approved as an ETF. I could imagine as the Ethereum Foundation. So being like an ETF commodity maybe gives them a lot of like limitations in terms of like what they can do on the technical side. So that basically limits Ethereum as a protocol to evolve kind of freely into where the market wants it to be. So that's why I feel like Ethereum Foundation, maybe Solana Foundation, or maybe IoTeX Foundation one day, right? So if you really like embrace ETF, then does that mean like the project will stagnate?
Yes, I appreciate that insight. So, Raullen, now I've reached a point in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. Now, these are 10 fun questions. I ask them every week. They're the same questions every time. And I do it because, first of all, it lets us get to know you a little bit better. But I think listeners will potentially learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their own life by virtue of the answers that we hear from folks like you each week. So, Raullen, are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Not too ready. Okay, let's give it a try.
The GRTiQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
There are so many books. I read a lot, actually. Yeah, I always say this, like the hard things about hard things is definitely like an eye-opening. Yeah, From Zero to One is also very good.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
I think Kung Fu Panda, because my kids actually love them. You have to be optimistic, right? No matter where you are, what you do.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
Maybe some Mozart music.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
Follow your heart. Stephen Jobs.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
That we're so blind to our blind spot.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
Oh, intermittent fasting and run marathon.
Based on your own life experience and observations, Raullen, what's the one habit or characteristic that you think best explains how or why people find success in life?
Optimistic, beat hard.
And then the final 3 questions are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
724, full of innovation.
And if you're on X, formerly called Twitter, I still call it Twitter, you should be following?
I should be following you. I feel like you have a lot of good questions.
I really appreciate that. I'm humbled by that. And the final question, I'm happiest when?
DP becomes a real thing, actually making the world a better place.
The GRTiQ 10.
And I show you how deep.
Raullen Chai, thank you so much for joining the GRTiQ podcast. What a thrill to have you on and to hear your ideas. A lot of great insight today, and especially around the origins of DePIN and your vision for how important that is and what will happen into the future. If listeners want to stay in touch with you, follow the things that you're working on, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
Yeah, for IoTeX, please follow IoTeX_IO. For myself, it's just my name, Raullen, Raullen.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTiQ
Podcast. Roger that.